Good morning. Welcome back to Flawed Dogs. When we last left them, Heidi met Uncle Hamish, and there's a dog show on the backyard of their estate, of which Heidi was going to inherit, apparently. Chapter 8, $180,000. Out! There's that word again, popping into her head for the second time today, pressing on the inside of her skull as she hurried through the front door toward the McLeod Heavenly Acres gate. Out! Out! Now this word, too. Away! Also these. Go, now, quick, before anyone pulls you back into this cuckoo land of demented dog dips. She passed Violet carrying a tray of champagne glasses toward the backyard, baby Bruno strapped happily across her back. Heidi, where are you going? Fiji. She kept moving, then suddenly stopped at the gate, remembering the dachshund bouncing around in her bag. She pulled the dog out and set him on the lawn at the edge of the woods, where he wobbled a bit as he looked up at her. That was fun, he said. What's next, partner? Shh! Go! You're liberated. Join a pack of wolves. He looked at her squarely. I have to tell you, banana taffy is my new favorite thing. Heidi began backing away, but the little dog followed. No, go! Go! She yelled. They don't allow dogs in Fiji. They pee on the coconuts. This was genius. Her tone turned angry. Oh, sorry, this was a guess. Her tone turned angry. Go very far away. I'm doing the same. The dachshund kept following. Heidi put her face down to his and was about to scream louder than when he licked the underside of her nose. Oh, scream louder when he licked the underside of her nose. She froze at this unexpected attack. A familiar shriek from behind made her jump. She turned to see Mrs. Nutbush from the airport, still in her blue fur coat, run in and scoop up the dachshund, holding it above her head. My lost little Douglets Toft, where have you been, naughty boy? The dog looked as if it was about to be eaten, which, in a sense, it was. Heidi looked down the road to freedom. Then she looked back at Mrs. Nutbush, her terrified dog in hand. Ugh, muttered Heidi under her breath as she pulled the little dog from the woman's grasp, giving him the sternest, angry nun look that she could muster. Naughty boy is right. Always chasing big, blue... She looked at Mrs. Nutbush. Critters. Well, now, who are you? Why do you have my Douglets tufted Austrian red dachshund? Stammered the flustered woman, reaching for the shaking animal. Heidi backed away. I'm Heidi McLeod, and this, she needed a name. Her imagination failed her. Sam. My dog Sam. Sam? Sam? Repeated Mrs. Nutbush, suspicious. Yeah, good old Sam the lion. An entirely perfect name, Sam the lion. Heidi looked down at Sam and gave him a little eyebrow flash, which is more a warning than a wink, meaning, we're both in it up to our butts now, pal. Sam looked back at her in panic. Do not hand me back to the blue and hairy woman, he said. I will throw up taffy and fries on her. Mrs. Nutbush narrowed her eyes and leaned in to Heidi. I think the police might like to know why a discarded snot-nosed orphan McLeod has a one-of-a-kind $180,000 Douglets dachshund, she sneered. Heidi's eyes popped. $180,000? She looked down at Sam. Do you poop rubies? Why would you have such a dog? Demanded Mrs. Nutbush. Good question. Heidi opened her mouth. Nothing. It was a gift from her uncle, said a voice from behind. It was Miss Violet, holding a punch bowl containing a humming baby Bruno. Goodness, no reason to involve the police with an honest misunderstanding, Mrs. Nutbush, she said as she laid a gentle hand atop Heidi's strewn hair and stared carefully into the girl's surprised face. You're late, Miss McLeod. The competition is about to start. Take Sam the lion here and hurry on to register. Heidi, too confused to argue, moved back through the gate, past the huge dog-shaped bushes and toward the house. She looked back at Miss Violet, who gave her an eyebrow flash. Nobody before had given her an eyebrow flash. A smiling Violet turned to a shocked Mrs. Nutbush. Violet dabbed her eyes with a corner of her apron. Heidi and Sam's first show. A big moment for all of us. Sniff. Mrs. Nutbush snorted a suspicious snort. pushed past Violet and stomped after the girl holding her $180,000 Douglets Dachshund. Heidi walked as if in a trance, back toward the dreadful place that she had just run from. Sinister cosmic forces beyond her understanding had seized her life, she figured. All she could do was put one foot in front of the other and not fall over. Carrying Sam and his Douglets Tuft whatever thing, she stumbled toward the jostling crowd in their trash can lid hats and their hydraulic dresses and their powdered pooferized dogs, and the gathering realization that this was going to be the end of her life. She found herself at the end of a long line of fancy people with fancy dogs at the center of McCloud Heavenly Acres' back lawn. She stood frozen in dazed terror, gripping Sam close to her chest, upside down. She was in a dog show. The horror. The competition was about done. Heidi became dimly aware of people clapping and cheering. She looked up to see a beaming Mrs. Beaglehole getting back in line after showing the dazzling, show-stopping Cassius. The people in the surrounding lawn chairs clapped loudly while Mrs. Beaglehole smiled triumphantly and made a little bow to the crowd. The big poodle had won the Piddleton Best in Show for the past 3 years. He would grease this one, and Mrs. Beaglehole knew it. The World Championship Westminster Show in New York City lay in the future. Cassius would win Best in Show, the most beautiful dog on the planet. They both knew this. "Wait a minute, ladies and gentlemen," announced a lady with a microphone and a clipboard at the center of the lawn. "A last-minute entry has been added. Oh, what a lovely surprise. Heidi McCloud, Hamish McCloud's niece, and her Austrian red dachshund, Ham the lion." "Sam," corrected Heidi in the tiniest whisper. The crowd went silent. A shocked Mrs. Beaglehole and Cassius spun their heads to stare at her at the end of the line. Then a frantic low murmuring raced through the crowd. "The little orphan McCloud girl. A McCloud hasn't shown up at their own dog show for 10 years. She looks like her mother. They say at her school she set the nuns' toilets to flush in reverse." Heidi heard all of this, which made her mortification complete. She wondered if the others could hear the pounding of her heart. "Miss McCloud and Sam the lion," said the woman in center, gesturing toward Heidi. "The judges await." Heidi stared. The judges awaited what? Here was the dog in her hands. What else did they need? The clipboard woman gestured to her to do something. What? What did people do at dog shows? Hundreds of eyes were on her as her panic slipped into action, and she instantly went with her best guess. She put Sam on the ground. Then she began to dance. She'd been good at dancing, and her freestyle was legendary among the students at St. Egregious. So she played Elvis's hound dog in her head, closed her eyes, and let it all fly. Sam stared up at Heidi's windmilling arms and legs and wondered if this simply was what all human beings suddenly did around noon every day. So he began to dance as well. Hopping, twirling, bouncing. Heidi smiled. He looked like he was on a hot skillet. Then Sam noticed Mrs. Nutbush. She was in the crowd and moving closer, dead set, he figured, on eating him. So Sam did what worked before and shot up Heidi's legs to find high ground. In this case, the top of her head. The tittering began. Tittering is polite laughter that never stays polite. Eventually, all 300 dog lovers were spewing champagne punch through their noses in open hysterics. Heidi only danced harder, while Sam hung on. He found himself nose to nose with the judge. Her eyes went to the top of his head. The judge stopped laughing. "The Douglets Tuft," she said in an odd whisper normally saved for matters of religion or premium gossip. Her mouth dropped. Then slowly, one by one, Piddleton's fanciest citizens began murmuring the same thing. "The Douglets, the Douglets." And one by one they stood in solemn reverence, as if the Pope himself had suddenly alighted upon Heidi McCloud's head. "You ready to see the Douglets Tuft? Brace yourself. Be sitting down so you don't pass out and fall. There it is, in all its glory, the Douglets Tuft." The most supernaturally beautiful dog that had ever seen was before them. Sam's perfect proportions, crowned with his tuft born of almost inconceivably careful breeding, was almost more than they could take. Flemmy Croup in the back fainted and needed slapping. For a moment, Heidi thought that her dancing had won the crowd over, but then realized that all eyes were on Sam. She looked up at her uncle's window. The curtains were parted enough for her to see that his face appeared down. Suddenly, it was gone. The judge approached and handed Heidi a large silver trophy cup while people clapped. Heidi had never won anything in her life other than timeouts in the closet from the nuns. She looked around at the grinning, cheering strangers, who suddenly didn't seem so strange anymore. The judge tied a blue ribbon around Sam's neck and smiled at the dog. Sam grinned back. "I love banana taffy," he said. And there is Sam and Heidi dancing. Chapter 9, Gopher. The crowd roared their approval and then very suddenly hushed in silence. They parted as if somebody important was moving through. More murmuring. "It's Hamish McLeod, hidden for all these years. He's come out." Heidi's uncle, still in his robe and pajamas, moved unsteadily toward her, wincing in the noon light as would a prisoner emerging from a dark prison cell. He looked at Heidi and then at Sam. He plucked the dog from her head and stretched out his long torso, examining his ears, nose, toes, fur, and finally the wonderful tuft. He looked back, down at Heidi. "Where did you get him, niece?" The crowd stared. Heidi saw Miss Violet standing off to the side with a plate of little sandwiches. She smiled sadly at Heidi and didn't give her an eyebrow flash. Heidi looked up at Hamish and then at Sam. "He just, dropped into my life." "Is he yours?" asked Hamish. "No!" thundered another voice. The crowd parted yet again, revealing Mrs. Nutbush in her blue fur, stomping toward them across the lawn, waving a shipping receipt. Her pointy heels suddenly sank into a mushy patch in the grass, and she stopped, struggling to pull free. Heidi dropped a horrified Sam to the ground. "Run!" she screamed. "Go, run, free, live in the forest like a gnome!" Sam didn't run. It had been a confusing day, but one thing was very, very clear. He didn't want to live like a gnome. He wanted only one thing now. Looking up at Heidi, he knew exactly what it was. Mrs. Nutbush wobbled closer toward Sam, arms reaching out, eyes ablaze, fur gyrating and flying. "Enough is enough," thought Sam the lion. "Time for action." He turned to face all the show dogs lined up beside him. He yelled one word, very loud and very clear. The other dogs pricked their ears. There are exactly 4 words that are genetically guaranteed to turn a gaggle of pampered lapdogs into a mob of killers. Federal, Express, Guy are 3. The 4th is the word that Sam now said. "Gopher!" And at the sound of it, the dogs spun their heads and spotted a furry blue rodent of monstrous proportions. And there she is, the furry blue gopher. Mrs. Nutbush froze 5 yards from Sam. 4 dozen of Piddleton's finest purebreds blocked her way, noses flaring. Mrs. Nutbush flared her own nostrils right back at them. Sam uttered the magic word again. "Gopher! Gopher!" they repeated like a chant. "Gopher! Gopher!" Goodbye. The human owners dove to avoid the explosion of their howling, barking darlings galloping across the lawn, leashes ripped from their gloved hands. Led by a snapping, saliva-spewing Shih Tzu named Mr. Tinkles, the 52 elegant show dogs chased a screaming Mrs. Nutbush and her blue gopher fur coat through the orange meringue on the dessert table, under the coffee cart, and directly through the Heavenly Acres reflecting pond. And there they go, the 2-pager. Now, this is a shocking and violent part of the story, and there's no need to dwell on the details. All that anyone needs to know is that by the time the Piddleton Police Department removed Mrs. Nutbush from the empty Heavenly Acres dog kennel into which she had dived, she was mostly naked but unhurt. Her blue fur coat, however, would be aggravating the delicate bowels of Piddleton's parlor dogs for weeks to come. Hamish McLeod and Heidi watched as a babbling, blanket-wrapped Mrs. Nutbush was strapped to a gurney and driven away in an ambulance. Her car was towed by the police captain, who turned to Heidi and said that it might take some time until the woman recovered from her emotional collapse. Would Heidi mind looking after Mrs. Nutbush's new Austrian red Douglets dachshund and give him a home? Heidi looked at Sam, who looked back at her. She gave him a little eyebrow flash. She thought he gave her one back. Sure, said Heidi quietly. Now, there's a word, thought Heidi. Home. Hamish put an arm across her shoulders, and they both turned to walk back toward her new one. Oh, boy. Chapter 10, Murder. Heidi slept in her room by herself for the first time since she could remember. No other girls, no nuns, no locked doors. Only one dachshund curled up in the crook of her knees, a first for both. She slept, exhausted from the day and the dizzy reality that her life had turned upside down, becoming an object that she could at least begin to see as something having a recognizable shape. Beyond that, all bets were off. Sam couldn't sleep himself. He had a human of his own. He was lying in the bend of her knees, and they were all on this marvelous thing called a bed. Who could sleep? He looked at the slumbering girl, her butt arched toward the ceiling, arms bent in a pretzel below her stomach, and saliva pooling slightly on the pillow below her open mouth, exhaling wheezing half-snortles unique to exhausted, happy 14-year-olds. They're so cute when they're sleeping, he said to himself. I'm definitely keeping her. Eager to explore the huge house, Sam jumped to the floor and wandered out of the room and into the upstairs hallway, which seemed to stretch for miles. Light glowed around a half-open door at the distant end. He loped toward it, curious who in this wonderful place would be up so late. With a long nose, Sam pushed the door open. Uncle Hamish looked up from his desk, wireless spectacles balanced on the end of his nose. His face stretched into a beaming smile. Sam the Lion, our champion. Come here, lad, and let me have a close look at you, and that marvelous tuft. Hamish held his hands out wide, welcoming and warm. Sam walked carefully toward the man in the pajamas. Hamish swept the dog up into his large hands and held him toward the lamp. With quiet awe, he moved his eyes over the perfect lines of Sam's profile. A once-in-a-lifetime masterpiece, Hamish murmured. Thanks, said Sam, licking Hamish under the nose. Hamish looked startled. For a moment he considered returning the kiss, but instead ran a hand across the top of the Douglas tuft, down Sam's neck and across the length of his lanky back. You and I are going to be great friends, said Hamish, and you are going to go to great places. Hamish cradled Sam across his arm and walked to the open French doors looking out over the estate and the rolling hills glowing a milky blue below an autumn Vermont moon. He leaned his knees against the stone railing high above the ground, holding Sam up and out so he could see the horizon. The McLeods are back, Sam. You're going to be the champion of the world, dear boy. My champion. Sam hadn't the slightest clue what that meant, but he knew the hands that held him firmly and that stroked his head with warmth and strength were not unkind, and he liked it. But there was someone else in the shadows of the great room who had heard these words but did not like any part of them. Cassius stepped forward out of the shadows of an alcove, the flickering firelight dancing across his lips curled up with rage. His teeth, polished to a glistening brilliance with Dr. Doogie's doggy dental powder, sparkled. His eyes glowed with more than malice. It was murder. There's only one champion in this family, whispered the huge poodle as he crept back toward the back of Hamish, still holding Sam into the chilly sky against the low stone railing. And it is not a ridiculous Frankfurter on feet with a bit of laundry lint on his head. He stopped 2 yards from Hamish and Sam, facing the sky, breathing heavily, his breath misting from the cool air of the open window. A single impact at the man's shoulder blades would send him and his new creature toward the stone porch below. He hesitated for only one reason. This was going to scuff his nails. Still, sacrifices had to be made. Cassius bent his rear legs, preparing to spring. Heidi awoke in her huge room, thirsty. She reached for Sam behind her knees. Not there. She padded in bare feet out of the room and into the hall, whispering Sam's name. So many rooms. Heidi saw the light at the end of the hall in the uncle's study. She moved toward it, a faint feeling of unease urging her feet toward the light. Hot cocoa? Said Mrs. Beaglehole, stepping out from the hall's darkness and in front of Heidi, scaring her. The large woman held a glass in front of the girl. She was blocking her. Heidi felt the hair on her neck rise. Poor dear, said Mrs. Beaglehole. You can't sleep after the excitement today. This will help. Have you seen Sam? Asked Heidi, suddenly suspicious and ignoring the glass. Why, no, but I'm sure he's near. Go back to bed and I'll look, dear. Heidi nudged the big woman aside and moved toward her uncle's door. Reaching it, she flipped on the light switch, bathing the room in brilliance. Outside the French window on the veranda, Hamish spun around, Sam in his arms. He looked down to see Cassius behind him, crouched, ears down. Cassius froze, then dropped to the floor, feigning a yawn to mask his murderous rage. Heidi, it's so late, said her uncle, surprised. Heidi stood in the study doorway, blinking in the light. Sam was gone. I didn't know where he went. Mrs. Beaglehole and a pale Miss Violet came up from behind Heidi. We do now, Mrs. Beaglehole said with an odd, dark smile. She held up baby Bruno's knitted sweater. It had been violently shredded by sharp teeth. And that is where we'll stop for today. All right, have a good day.